In all my years working with teenagers and parents, I've come to the conclusion that parenting teenagers is a bit like the movie Titanic. Some days it feels like you're flying, and other days it feels like a total disaster movie and you're going to end up at the bottom of the ocean. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips that will hopefully help you become unsinkable. I'm Oliver and I'm a family systems therapist, and I've run treatment centers for teens and families and helped countless parents just like you weather the stormy ups and downs of adolescence. My colleague Cindy and I used to love using this metaphor of Titanic in the parent groups that we ran to give guidelines to living with teenagers so that maybe one day your heart will go on. Maybe you just won't let go. There are so many good lines. But seriously, what does the Titanic have to do with teenagers? Well, there are 5 valuable lessons that we can learn from this movie that apply to parenting teenagers. If you like this video, let me know in the comment section below if you're feeling more like Jack, Rose, the Iceberg, or Titanic. Go grab your popcorn and let's dive in. The first lesson is staying calm. Let's start with the most obvious thing in the movie, the iceberg. I think we can all remember that essentially chaos ensued when the Titanic hit the iceberg. People were freaking out, losing their minds, but the ones who stayed calm were the ones that survived. And Jack did not freak out, nor did he freak out on Rose when he was clinging to that little door in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean while facing an icy death. It would not have been the same movie if Jack and Rose had let their anxiety get in the way. They would have been bickering the whole time, which does not make for good movie watching, or they would have had one big blow up and gone their separate ways. Also not a good movie. Jack and Rose had a fair amount of anxiety trying to get off the ship, and as parents of teens, there's a huge amount of anxiety floating around your family. And a quick reminder that anxiety is just a response, a natural response to stress. Anxiety is actually quite useful to us in an evolutionary perspective because it heightens our senses and gives us a bit of an adrenaline boost. But if it's the only tool that we use, the only response that we have, it becomes maladaptive and ultimately just not that helpful to have. It would have totally got in the way of Jack and Rose's relationship, and anxiety will get in the way of your relationship with your children if you let it. So we know a couple of things about anxiety. Number 1, it's infectious. If one animal in the pack sees a lion, they have a response to that threat. It's a stressor, and they become anxious, and the anxiety spreads around the whole pack, and the next thing you know, the pack is running. And you might notice this in your own house. If your co-parent comes home anxious from work, everybody in the family feels it. Maybe your teen comes home in a bad mood, stressed out from school, and the conversation you were just enjoying fizzles out. That's because the anxiety spreads around the family. Number 2, anxiety is a primitive feeling. It locks us into fight, flight, or freeze. And when we are in that mode of being, our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logic, is not online. So essentially, we're not doing anything too rational. When your teenager comes home with blue hair and piercings in places you didn't know existed, it's important not to let that anxiety turn into panic. Anxiety will shut communication down, and teenagers really need to know that they can come to you with anything without feeling judged or punished. The question here is, do you want to be more like the iceberg or more like Jack? Because your anxiety can take down the Titanic, or it can get Rose to a lifeboat. Lesson 2, be aware. The captain of the Titanic did not see that iceberg coming until it was too late. And I think that is an excellent reminder that we all have to be aware of what is going on in our teenagers' environment, particularly what goes on outside the household. Jack had this kind of uncanny awareness of every corner and passage in the Titanic, and he seemed to know the entire landscape, or boatscape, and it proved really useful to him and Rose. If we were to go out sailing into the stormy seas of the teenage years, what should we be aware of? You'd want to know things like where the shoreline is, what the weather's like, how deep the water is, what the wind is like. Are there any icebergs? And in a similar way, we need to know and be aware of what's going on in their lives and be involved to a certain degree in the lives of our teenagers. So that doesn't mean you have to become a helicopter and be too involved in everything that they do, but it does mean being present and being aware. Some of my favorite questions to get parents to ask themselves are things like, who are their friends? What do they like to do outside of the home? Who are they talking to online? What do they share on social media? Now, remember, we have more chances of having an open dialogue with a teenager when we're calm, but sometimes teenagers are secretive or just don't want to open up. And I think in this case, being reflective internally can be helpful before talking to your child. The second round of questions I get parents to ask themselves are more self-reflective. These are things like, what is going on in this family that my child could be responding to? What has changed in my family? What is going on between me and my co-parent that could be impacting my teen? If all behaviors are a form of communication, what might my teenager's behaviors be trying to convey to me? What am I contributing to this situation? These are just some questions that you might want to ask yourself. And remember, you can't change the iceberg, but you can change how you respond to it. And don't worry about taking notes on this. I'm going to put a PDF of some of the slides on this video up on my blog. And if you sign up for the mailing list, I'll tell you a little bit more about the parenting course that we've just gone live with on mypeoplepatterns.com. You might find it really useful. So lesson number 3 is about sticking with the boat. Now, I think it's important to clarify that if you're on a ship and it's sinking, you do not want to stick with that ship. I'm not going down like those old people did. So this is about sticking with the small lifeboat. When the Titanic started sinking, people started jumping ship and trying to save themselves. But the ones who stuck with the lifeboats were obviously the ones who made it out alive. So this might seem like an obvious question, but why do we stick with those lifeboats? Well, that's where the resources are. That's where safety is. They keep us afloat and they help us be identifiable when rescue ships come along. This is what you are to your teen. Despite their current mood or what their behaviors are, you are the lifeboat in a stormy ocean to them. More than a few of the parents that I've worked with would probably admit that sometimes they just don't want to be on that lifeboat anymore. They want to swim away from that one, away from the one that their teen is headed towards, and find another one. And it is totally normal to want to escape from those moody teenage storms that come our way. Our natural tendency is to become anxious when there's a stressor, and moody teenagers, as much as you love them, are a big stressor. So it's very natural for parents to be extremely anxious and want to retreat, but sticking with the boat, if we can contain our anxiety, is totally manageable. And we can all stay on the same boat if we hold on to our sense of self and not get swept up in our kids' anxiety, our co-parents' anxiety. This is all about remaining calm and thinking clearly, not reacting due to our anxiety. And we need to be calm in the lifeboat because our teenagers need to know, no matter what, we've got their back and we're a safe place for them. Even if they mess up, we're not going to abandon them. We'll be there and we'll help them get back on track. Lesson 4 is don't drop the anchor. This at first felt quite counterintuitive to me, but apparently it's common sailing knowledge that when your ship hits a storm or has some damage, you don't want to drop or lower the anchor. This is particularly true in a storm because that's when the most damage would occur. The storm might be stronger than your boat and it might rip the anchor clean out of the hull. So dropping the anchor locks us down and makes things rigid when actually we need to be more flexible in a crisis. Jack and Rose didn't stay still and have deep and meaningful conversations. They moved around a lot, all up and down the ship, and it ended up being what helped Rose survive. Becoming more rigid in our parenting can be about being more inflexible with our rules and expectations. And it can also sound like a lot of no's and because I said so's. Depending on the situation, this might exacerbate things for a teenager who's looking for a more adult relationship and wants to experience more independence and negotiate things. I tend to find that we are more likely to get rigid with rules and behaviors and throw down our anchors when we're too anxious. So again, we've got to find ways as parents to deal with our anxiety before connecting with teenagers. On a slightly different note, there's a saying that goes, an anchor is heavy, but regret is even heavier. So when parenting teenagers, it's important not to hold on to past grudges or past mistakes, which is hard if there's been a lot, but you can't enter a situation still fuming from the last one. It's really healthy to let go of what you can and approach each situation with a clearer mind. And I know that is very hard. Holding on to anger and resentment only weighs you down and prevents you from moving forward. So let it go or find a way to seek a resolution and focus on the present and the future if you possibly can. Lesson 5, learn about icebergs and what happens in our ships. Last but not least, we need to learn about icebergs and what happens to our ships if we get hit by one. So did you notice how Jack seemed to know an awful lot about exactly how the Titanic would behave as it sank? So somehow he knew to run to the back of the boat when it started tilting. It's a rather suspicious part of the storyline in my opinion, but the metaphor continues regardless. Just like Jack knew how the Titanic was going to behave as it was going down, we need to know about our own behaviors and the people patterns that we get stuck in. I think it's essential for parents of teens to learn about their people patterns. And as a family systems therapist, what I'm trying to do in my job is I'm trying to identify and interrupt dysfunctional patterns in communication or dysfunctional patterns of behavior and relating. This is one of the main things I talk about in the Fortified Relationships course, which you can find out more about on mypeoplepatterns.com. So a quick example of a people pattern here that came up this week, actually in a family session, is the people pattern. So mom gets anxious and starts asking a series of rapid fire questions to her child. Her child then becomes moody or angry, and mom grills even more. I mean, she's only trying to help. So she might demand to see homework or snoop around online, which makes her child retreat even more and perhaps even hiding things from mom, which actually makes her more anxious. This is a people pattern. It's a cyclical loop that will go on and on until I can interrupt it and either help mum with her anxiety and find different ways for her to deal with it that don't involve interrogating her son, or I need to find a way to help the teenager deal with his irritation. I need him to deal with his anger in a different way that doesn't perpetuate this cycle. This is one of many people patterns that I see in the families that I work with. And these are often dysfunctional patterns of relating that really get in the way of us having healthy, happy relationships with the people that we love the most. Knowing and identifying some of your behaviors and people patterns that you get stuck in is a bit like knowing how the ship will react when it starts sinking. We've got to know what to expect, and that is the first step in making changes in a family. So my people patterns and the Fortified Relationships course is all about helping people grow great relationships, and especially with parents and teenagers. Okay, so there you have it. There are 5 valuable lessons that we can learn from Titanic that apply to parenting teenagers. You've got to stay calm, be aware, stick with the boat, don't drop the anchor, and learn about behaviors, about what happens with icebergs. Parenting teenagers can be tough, but it can be a joy as well. And knowing a little bit about our people patterns and having some more knowledge and a little bit of love, we can all be unsinkable. Hit follow and subscribe if you want more of this.